evening, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be in this forum. Today, we are going to discuss something about venous thromboembolism and cancer. The management of VTEs are indeed challenging. Venous thromboembolisms in cancer is increasing relevant today as well. The management is, of course, a multidisciplinary approach. Surgeons are an important member of the multidisciplinary team. Of course, we would require the expertise of intensivists, anesthetists, vascular surgeons, etc., cardiologists, etc., in the ultimate management of some of these patients. Having said that, it is very important from the surgical perspective to have some idea and some understanding concepts of venous thromboembolism, and especially some of the exciting recent advances that have happened in this field. Of course, the recent buzz in VTEs has been in view of the COVID-19, wherein people believe that more than a lung infection, it is supposed to be a hypercoagulable state. Of course, it is under some contention. When we talk about venous thromboembolism and its manifestations in cancer, we talk of deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, and very rarely we also talk about visceral and splanchnic vein thrombosis, and also catheter-associated thrombosis, which is increasingly being relevant today with the advent of modern systemic chemotherapeutic agents. The association of venous thromboembolism and cancer is very relevant here. The fact remains that patients with cancer are at an elevated risk than the general population. The annual rates in cancer-afflicted patients is in the range of 0.5 to 20%, whereas the annual rates in the general population, that is patients without cancer, is only in the range of 0.1 to 2%. So a significant elevated risk for patients with cancer for VTE. The mechanisms, of course, I will not go into the details. This is something pretty elementary, basic, the virtuous triad, which is spoken ever since about 100 years ago. And again, it is a combination of various factors, hypercoagulable state, endothelial injuries, and here again, central venous catheters are relevant. Surgical procedures cause a little amount of venous stasis as well. All in all, cancers produce some amount of tissue factors. So a combination of all three factors results in VTE. The clinical implications of these things are very important. It not only causes an increased morbidity, but of course it has the potential to delay the oncological treatments in patients. Of course, there are increases in healthcare expenses. And more importantly, a lot of studies have said that there is a negative prognostic impact of VTE beyond the direct VTE-related mortality. So cancer patients with VTE do poorly than non-cancer patients with VTE, irrespective of the VTE-related mortality. And this is very important from the surgical perspective to understand and evaluate and manage these patients. So much so, thrombotic events are believed to be the second leading cause of death in cancer patients after cancer per se itself. So it's really important that we sort of study these factors and manage these patients well. To do this, we need a formal risk assessment. And the risk assessment takes into criteria about a couple of dozens of criteria, which are related to the cancers per se. Primary site is very important, which will come in the next slide. Stage is again important. Higher the stage, higher the risk of VTE. Adenocarcinomas, for some reasons, have a higher incidence of VTEs when compared to the squamous. And it is known that within the first few months of cancer diagnosis, the risk of VTE is very high. Number of treatment-related factors are also important, not just surgery, duration of surgery more than 60 minutes. So any surgery that is more than 60 minutes has a potential for increased risk of VTE. Also certain chemotherapeutic agents, certain hormonal agents, and also radiotherapy per se. What is more important from the biomarker perspective is there are certain regular hematological parameters, hemoglobin less than 10, leukocytes elevation more than 11,000, and a platelet count elevation more than 3.5 lakhs. These have been shown as biomarkers for increased incidence of VTE. As this slide shows, certain cancers, for example, the gastrointestinal cancers, including pancreatic cancers, have a much higher risk of VTE vis-a-vis compared to other cancers, for example, the breast cancers and sometimes the colon cancers as well. Now, for a formal risk assessment, there have been a couple of scores, and the most important, the most relevant of the scores have been the Corona score. The Corona score is classified by 5 characteristics: the site of cancer, again, the platelet counts, hemoglobin, leukocyte counts, and the body mass index. It's scored from 1 to 6, or any score more than 2 is considered to be increasingly relevant for higher risk of thromboembolism. As shown in this, the Corona score, the patients are triaged into low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk based on their risk assessment of getting VTEs. You have other scores as well, apart from the Corona scores, like, for example, the Caprini model, which is there for a thrombotic risk assessment, and it is slightly more complicated, taking into consideration various points apart from just these 5 factors taken in the Corona score. And you could give a risk score for these patients. Any risk score more than 5 in the Caprini model would mean a high risk of thrombosis. There are other scores apart from the Corona score and the Caprini score: the PROTECT score, which takes into consideration certain chemotherapeutic agents, and the Vienna CAT score, which is becoming increasingly popular, which takes into consideration certain biomarkers like the D dimers and P selective. In fact, a lot of talks are going on that there would be a modified Corona score in the near future, taking into consideration the biomarkers of D dimer and P selective as well. Now, switching gears, let's see what are the common agents that have been used traditionally in the management of venous thromboembolisms. The first 3 agents have got a systemic dosing. Either they are given as a subcutaneous dosing, or they could be given heparins, for example, as an intravenous dosing. Whereas the last 2, the vitamin K antagonists, that is warfarin, that has been used for many, many years now, has an oral administration. And we all know that with oral administration, you might have a better compliance. And hence, the advent of the direct oral anticoagulable agents, are called the DOACs, has caused a recent buzz in the market of venous thromboembolism. It's very important to understand in the cartoon with regards to the extrinsic pathway and the intrinsic pathway. Again, this is pretty elementary. I won't really go into the details, but to put things in perspective, we must understand how these agents and where these agents act. For example, warfarin acts against the extrinsic pathway 7A. A majority of the DOACs, the direct oral agents, act against 10A. Dabigatran is the agent that acts actually on 2A. The low molecular weight heparins that we use normally acts on 2A and 10, and unfractionated heparin has got a multiple targets. So we must understand the mechanism of action of some of these agents to understand things and put it in better perspective. At the same time, it is also very important to understand what are the contraindications, and primarily there are 2. Any patient who's got a severe thrombocytopenia, that is a platelet count of less than 20,000, I think the use of anticoagulants would be prohibitively contraindicated in that circumstance. And also whenever the patient has got a potentially life-threatening bleeding or bleeding tendency. So whenever we talk of administration of anticoagulants in the clinical scenario, we would assume that the patients have got a normal renal function test, a normal thrombocyte count, and does not have a potentially life-threatening disorder. Again, we must understand that the VTE management revolves around 2 settings. The prophylactic setting, in which we identify patients who are at high risk and give them some type of pharmacological prophylaxis. The other is the therapeutic setting, that is, the patients have already developed a VTE, in which you give treatments for these patients to reduce the risk of VTE recurrence and mortality. So it's very important for us to differentiate the prophylactic setting from therapeutic setting. We've got a number of evidence-based management guidelines, and very recently the NCCN updated its guideline. The ASCO and the ITAC updated their guidelines in 2019. Of course, we have the other guidelines as well, and these will sort of guide the treatments for prophylaxis as well as treatment for cancer-associated thrombosis. Now let's first take in the prophylactic aspect. And majority of the guidelines would say in the perspective of cancer, that is, any patient who has got a cancer, plus if he's got some amount of risk factors like an acute medical illness or a reduced mobility, he should be offered pharmacological thromboprophylaxis. The guideline says that routinely hospitalized patients should not be given pharmacological thromboprophylaxis only if the patient has got an active malignancy and additional risk factors should it be offered. So basically, it's a type of a risk-adapted approach. And the risk-adapted approach is also there for the ambulatory patients. And these are the patients who come to the daycare and take their treatments and go. And again, here as well, routine pharmacological thromboprophylaxis should not be offered. There is a risk-adapted approach. The Khorana score of 2 or more has been taken in a number of randomized controlled trials, or any high-risk outpatient with cancer has to be offered some sort of pharmacological thromboprophylaxis. Again, it's important, like in certain cancers like multiple myelomas, especially in which you have given thalidomide as one of the treating agents, such cancers and such treatments put the patient under an increased risk of cancer-associated thrombosis. And one must be aware that these patients also qualify for pharmacological thromboprophylaxis. Again, the agents that are to be used in these are the low molecular weight heparins or the NOACs or the DOACs after a discussion with the patient. Again, the evidences for these approach are in the form of very robust evidences, 5 meta-analyses and very 2 recent publications, one in late 2018 and early 2019, the Abbott and the Cassini publication came saying that in ambulatory patients, you could use one of the direct oral anticoagulant agents like apixaban or rivaroxaban as compared to a placebo agent. Again, these are the drugs and which are doses which everyone should be aware of. Again, which is more relevant from the surgical perspective is what is the recommendations for cancer patients who are due to undergo surgery. And what the guideline clearly says that any patient with a cancer and who is to undergo a major surgical intervention, it could be majorly in the form of a major abdominal pelvic surgery or orthopedic surgery, for example, should be offered pharmacological thromboprophylaxis. And the agents recommended preferably is a low molecular weight heparin, and sometimes you could use an unfractionated heparin also in some of these circumstances. Mind you that the use of DOACs, that is the direct oral anticoagulant agents, is not there in patients that are going to have surgery because the evidence for using these direct agents is not much. So we must know that we tend to use more often either unfractionated heparin or more commonly the low molecular weight heparins. And these are a number of trials rather, in major abdominal surgeries that have shown a benefit of using not just low molecular weight heparins, but also the last 2 trials have shown extended usage, that is up to 4 weeks, is also beneficial. Again, there is the use of mechanical prophylaxis. Mechanical prophylaxis are in the form of either pneumatic devices or compression stockings. And again, they say that they should not be used as a monotherapy, but in certain highest risk patients, there is a benefit if you combine it with a pharmacological prophylaxis. The duration is very important, and this is something that practice supposed to be certain practice changing. The majority of the guidelines actually say that the prophylaxis for surgical patients should be started pre-operatively. Again, a majority of us would start it post-operatively based on the American protocol, and a lot of surgeons in the US would actually start the patients on VTE prophylaxis in the post-surgery, but you don't really have much evidence to substantiate the usage of VTE prophylaxis post-surgery. A lot of Europeans, and in fact, majority of the guidelines actually say that you must use prophylaxis to be really efficient, especially in high-risk patients. It has to be started pre-operatively, 2 to 12 hours prior to surgery. And if at all we make a decision to start, it has to be continued for at least 7 to 10 days. No point in stopping it prior. Again, you have a lot of randomized controlled trials to say that extended use, we saw a couple of trials earlier, extended use has a relative risk reduction of 55% in the incidence of venous thromboembolism. So again, there are a lot of systematic reviews which include 4 meta-analyses and up to 3 new randomized controlled trials that the low molecular weight heparins that are more commonly used in the surgical setting can be extended up to 4 weeks post-operatively for patients who have undergone either a major open or a laparoscopic abdominal or pelvic surgery. And not for further in high risk patients, like for example, patients who've got reduced mobility, obesity, history of VT, or any additional risk factors, the timing or the duration of prophylaxis should be extended to 4 weeks. Again, now let's shift gears. All we talked right now was up to prophylaxis, and now how do we actually manage a cancer patient who has got a cancer associated VTE or a cancer associated thrombosis? And this is again also a risk adapted approach. If we see the principles of treating a patient of cancer with thrombosis is absolutely no different of treating a patient without the cancer. Again, the endpoints is that is we must understand that these patients have got a VTE. So the aim of the giving these agents is to prevent a recurrent attack of VTE. At the same time, should not induce a bleeding, and at the same time, the mortality also should be under check. So if you see the randomized controlled trials, the endpoints of all the trials, or at least most of the trials, would be either a recurrent VTE, bleeding, or death. Again, you have two approaches. One is the initial anticoagulation approach, that is when a patient is diagnosed with the cancer-associated thrombosis. What do you give initially in the first 1 week or so, and how do you actually continue the patient subsequently? So in the first 1 week or so, I think there is evidence to use all the 4 agents, either low molecular weight heparin, has not a recommendation. Again, if you decide to use a low molecular weight heparin, it is preferred over an unfractionated heparin. Again, a lot of evidence is for dalteparin in this particular approach, and this is based on the CLOT study. The CLOT study was around 676 patients in which the experimental arm was continued dalteparin for 6 months, whereas in the control group was dalteparin for a week and then subsequently warfarin for about 6 months. The study clearly showed that the incidence of VTE was very, very less, about 9% in the dalteparin group versus 17% of the oral VTE group, amounting to a 52% risk reduction in continued or extended use of dalteparin for 6 months in the setting of a cancer-associated thrombosis. Again, the duration, as I mentioned, is up to 6 months, and we know that the low molecular weight heparins and the DOACs are actually better than vitamin K antagonists. Having said that, although we know that the warfarin is inferior, but in certain situations, especially when it comes to costs and logistics, more often you could use some amount of warfarin rather than not use anything at all. Again, this is the various drugs, all the 4 drugs, the unfractionated, low molecular weight, the fondaparinux, and the oral agents, the DOACs, that can be used in this setting of either the initial or subsequent therapies. Again, it's very important to reassess your patients after 6 months. Supposing the patient has got a cancer, active cancer, the patient has got a metastatic disease, or the cancer is not in remission for some reason, or you have ongoing anti-cancer therapies, then the recommendation is to continue the anticoagulation and even after and beyond 6 months as well. Again, it's important to understand what are the inherent differences between the agents. And I said there are issues with low molecular weight heparin. It has a subcutaneous dosage, and to get a subcutaneous dosage for a patient for every day for 6 months is going to be a little traumatic for the patients. Sometimes what happens is there is an issue of adherence of the patient to some of these agents, compliance to the regimens. So people were looking out for some alternative, and we knew that warfarin was there, it was available, but then it had a lot of side effects. So when the time came to introduce the DOACs, the direct oral anticoagulant agents, people saw that there is a new ray of hope in the management of VTE. Again, these direct agents, we must understand they have sort of revolutionized the management, especially in the last 5 years or so. But we must understand that the majority of the evidences comes from non-cancer patients initially, but of course there have been a lot of evidences in cancer patients at this point in time. When we refer to some of these agents, the dabigatran, as we saw in the mechanism action, acts against factor 2A. All the other agents, rivaroxaban, apixaban, and endoxaban, acts against factor 10A. And mind you, all these have got variable bioavailabilities and half-lives. and their excretion. So this is something that we must understand their PK/PD kinetics, and we must understand that all these drugs are administered orally for these patients. So the advantages of these oral agents are the efficacy-wise, they are very similar to warfarin. Obviously, oral is very convenient to use, and the patient's compliance is very good when we use some of these oral agents. There is a fixed dose, so absolutely no brainer for surgeons or anybody to use some of these agents, and it doesn't require any laboratory monitoring as well. So it all seems pretty good from this particular slide, but let's see the science behind this as well. Initial comparison was with warfarin and not low molecular weight heparin. So I think the initial meta-analysis or evidences prior to 2014 were less in cancer patients and less in comparison with low molecular weight heparins. But now you have a number of studies, at least 5 randomized control trials, which have compared these oral agents with the low molecular weight heparins. Again, these are the 4 trials at this point of time: the Hokusai, the Select, and the Adam trials. And mind you, most of the endpoints or the design of the trials is either a superiority or the non-inferiority. So we expect not much of difference in terms of incidence of VTE and bleeding with respect to the use of some of these agents. And most of these oral agents have been compared in randomized control trials with dalteparin, the low molecular weight heparin, because based on the CLOT study, in the incidence or in patients with cancer-associated thrombosis, dalteparin was the comparative arm. So we have a lot of trials, at least 4 to 5 trials, comparing these agents with dalteparin. Of course, this is a bird's eye view of the trials. It's very, I don't really want to go much into the details of it, but very broadly, if you see the outcomes of these trials, what broadly each of these trials have actually come out with, they say that use of oral agents have got lesser incidence of VTE. So definitely the oral agents, of course, they are non-inferior. Some studies say that they have met the superiority endpoint, but definitely some studies say that there is a higher bleeding rate in some of these studies, up to 1% significant risk of increasing bleeding with the use of DOAC. So it's not all that safe. You must be really careful with your choice of patients when you're selecting your patients for these newer agents. Of course, these studies have really conflicting results, and I would really not go into much of the details to add to the complexity of this. Again, so the various guidelines, because of these randomized control trials, they recommended endoxiban and rivaroxaban as alternatives. So apart from subcutaneous dosing of a low molecular weight, you had 2 oral agents according to the guidelines. And very recently, in fact, very neck deep when we were neck deep in the pandemic in March 2020, there was a Caravaggio trial which was published in the NEJM. This was apixaban versus dalteparin in the management of patients of VTE with cancer. Again, this also shows that apixaban, the rates of VTE were much lesser, 5.6% versus dalteparin, 7.9%, and no increased risk of bleeding or increased risk of death. So by and large, if you see efficacy-wise, they are slightly better, and in terms of complications, they are almost equivalent, and hence I think they have been recommended. So what is happening is that a lot of guidelines based on the evidences of the previous 3 randomized control trial and also the latest results of the Caravaggio trial. Of course, the ASCO guidelines and the ITAC guidelines were published in late 2019, and this randomized control trial came in March 2020. So this trial has not been has been factored into in a number of these guidelines, but by and large, this trial also is in line with the previous trials that say compare favorably with endoxiban and rivaroxaban. So from the clinical perspective, what it means to us, that is, in patients with cancer-associated thrombosis, we have one more agent, an oral agent, into our therapeutic armamentarium, and this is a really welcome sign. Of course, when it comes to the choice of one of the 4 oral agents, I think there is a lot of heterogeneity, so we must be very, very cautious. And this was brought out elegantly by Dr. Agnes Lee in his editorial, in which the Caravaggio trial was published in the NEJM. Again, importantly, we must know the concerns about these agents. As I said, these are oral agents with good bioavailability, but then we must be aware that there serious concerns also about the use of these agents. These agents have to be chosen very carefully. For example, I did mention that there is an increased risk of bleeding in some of the trials of endoxiban and rivaroxaban. In apixaban trial, the incidence of bleeding was slightly less, but nevertheless present, especially in mucosal cancers of the gastrointestinal tract and the genitourinary tract. Patients did witness a number of bleeding side effects, so one must be really careful in the choice of drug or choice of these agents, or rather the usage itself of these agents in the management of mucosal cancers of the gastrointestinal tract and the genitourinary tract in patients who have got established cancer-associated VTE. Again, the more important thing is because these are oral drugs, there are a lot of drug-drug interactions. I will come to in a little bit, and it has got some unique anti-cancer therapeutics. So again, the prerequisites are, as I said, thrombocytopenia again should not be there. If the thrombocyte count is less than 50,000, don't use these drugs. Expected drug-to-drug interactions, again, these drugs have been tried in only good performance status patients. Any frail patients will have to be really careful prior to recommending the DOACs. Again, in thrombocytopenia, as I said, we'll have other alternatives. Instead of using the oral DOACs, we use low molecular weight heparins or unfractionated heparins with a platelet transfusion in dosage depending upon the risk-adapted approach in these patients. It's very important to understand that these oral agents are substrates of the P-glycoprotein. They are metabolized by the cytochrome P450. A lot of anti-neoplastic drugs that we use, the taxanes, the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, some of them, and some of the drugs that are used, the anti-androgens in prostate cancers, these have some bearing. They also are metabolized by cytochrome P450. So it's very important before starting the patients on these agents to study the drug-drug interactions. And also it extends to the supportive care medications like steroids and some azole antifungal agents as well. More importantly, from the surgical perspective, these oral agents, rivaroxaban and endoxiban, are actually metabolized, absorbed from the stomach, apixaban from the proximal bar. So any patient who has undergone a gastric surgery or a bypass surgery or any colectomy, or any patient who even for that matter has got any side effects like nausea or vomiting, the bioavailability will be very, very less. And one must be cautious about the use of DOACs in such a setting. So whenever there is contraindication, for example, in thrombocytopenia, in cases of drug-drug interactions, or in cases of altered GI tract, it's always best to go back to the low molecular weight heparins. And again, the best evidence has been with dalteparin. Or in case we find that the logistics are a problem, try to use a vitamin K antagonist, that is a warfarin. Again, there are special clinical events also. For example, there is increasingly relevance of catheter-associated thrombosis, and these are very, very relevant because a lot of the patients, the present-day patients, chemotherapy is delivered through a central line or a port or a pigment, and these patients are at increased risk of thromboprophylaxis. Again, it is said that if these patients have a thrombosis, catheter-associated thrombosis, you'll have to treat these patients for at least 3 months with preferably low molecular weight heparin. And I know that in practice, at least a fifth of the patients actually don't land up getting any treatment. And it is not necessary to remove a line if there is a catheter-associated thrombosis, unless there is any infection, malfunction, or an incorrect position. Again, it's very important that with the advent of doing a lot of CT scans, we are detecting a lot of the incidental pulmonary embolism. And what to do in these patients is also, again, a dilemma. The guidelines, however, say that if there is a segmental or a more proximal VTE, then you'll have to treat these patients. And also, if supposing the patient has a subsegmental branch occlusion with a proximal DVT, then you'll have to treat some of these patients. Again, if it's purely asymptomatic PE in an isolated subsegmental location, guidelines say that you need not actually treat these patients. You must sort of use a case-by-case decision to make your judgment whether to treat or not this particular patient. Again, there are issues of splanchnic vein thrombosis. These are pretty rare, but in certain conditions like hepatocellular carcinomas, cholangiomas, or pancreatic cancers, splanchnic vein thrombosis can be there. And the guidelines are pretty clear in saying that if you have a symptomatic splanchnic vein thrombosis, then you will have to treat these patients preferably with a low molecular agent, or sometimes even a vitamin K antagonist, at least for about 3 months. So very quickly to end, I will go through a very a case summary of a patient, of a 75-year-old patient. To put things in perspective, that is, imagine that the patient is going to undergo a Whipple surgery. He's got secondary diabetes, a former smoker. Investigation is by and large normal. And again, the question arises is, how do we estimate the thrombotic risk and the bleeding risk of these patients, and what category he falls? Again, the answer is high thrombotic and low bleeding, and the reasons is because if we use the Caprini score, this patient is more than 75, gets 3 points. A major surgery, again, a Whipple's would last definitely more than an hour, maybe around 6 odd hours. Again, if the patient is undergoing any laparoscopic surgery, so again, couple of points. So this patient would actually be under a high risk based on the Caprini score. So it is important that this patient has got a high risk in Caprini. Again, if you use the bleeding assessment, and there is something called as an improved bleeding assessment, we find that based on the age and based on certain other characteristics, the patient did not have an increased risk of bleeding. So whenever we see a patient in the clinic based on certain clinical factors and certain laboratory values, we place the patients under certain risk of thrombosis or bleeding. And this patient had a high risk of thrombosis, low risk of bleeding. And that is the reason why venous thromboembolic prophylaxis was warranted in these patients. Again, this patient is a surgical patient, planned for surgery. That is why the choice of thromboprophylaxis would be a low molecular weight heparin. Again, these are the guidelines which we had elegantly talked about, the ASCO, the ATAC guidelines. Again, what is the duration? Again, we mentioned about the guidelines saying that this is a major abdominal surgery, and in the major abdominal surgery, 4 weeks is important. So again, these would be a typical case scenario in which you would make value-based judgments based on certain clinical criteria and based on certain risk assessment criteria. And finally, I think there have been some initial provocative studies, especially in lung cancers and many other cancers, saying that if you use anticoagulants in certain patients with cancers, they have a tendency to improve survival. So there was a recent buzz of having some studies done to use anticoagulants, not just for the properties of thromboprophylaxis or treatment, but to use it in an attempt to prolong the survival. And for the present, we don't really have much guidelines. Again, it's very important that all these decisions, the surgeon himself should understand a lot of these decisions, should be able to work with the team of intensivists, cardiologists, vascular surgeons, or any other person who is involved in the critical care of the patient, and also inform the patient about this, because there are important issues of adherence and tolerance about these agents, which is very, very important for us to factor. I would conclude this talk by saying that the management of cancer-associated thrombosis is increasingly relevant even today. It's a little challenging. It's a multidisciplinary approach, as I just alluded to. It's a teamwork, and the patient should also be informed about what treatment decisions are being made. And in the last 4 or 5 years, and especially in the last couple of years, with the advent of a couple of the randomized trials, like the Cassini, the AVERT trials, and very recently the Caravaggio trial, we have seen that the therapeutic armamentarium of surgeons and clinicians have been broadened with the advent of emerging evidence for the use of some of these agents of DOAC in the management of these patients. But having said that, I think this is an important area of further research, and then only then we will be able to risk stratify our patients better, identify which of the patients are at higher risk, rather than putting many of the patients on and cancer-associated thrombosis treatments and prophylaxis. Thank you again for your kind attention.
Thanks, Dr. Arvind, again for a nice lecture. Now the platform is open for questions, comments.
Sir, excellent talk as usual. One thing regarding the NOACs, when to suspect that the patient is getting toxicity with the NOACs, or in such situation, how to cope up with, whether it should be a sudden abrupt stoppage, and what is the next choice of the newer anticoagulant therapy?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. As I said, the evidence of DOACs in cancers is pretty recent. So the lot of evidence is there in non-cancer related areas. The important areas would be supposing the patient is for an important procedure, like for example, a patient is on DOACs and you'll have to take these patients for emergency surgery or any other emergency procedure. What needs to be done? I think that is very important, at least from the surgical perspective. Again, what they say is that this is an evolving area. The stoppage of DOACs should be done in some of these circumstances. There are, in fact, a couple of antidotes that are available in the market to sort of, to neutralize the effect of DOACs. But a lot of people, especially if you're planning for elective surgery, would try to stop the DOACs. Again, it's also based on the risk perception of the patients, based on the half-life of the DOAC that you're using. And so I think this is a decision that a person who is starting the DOAC would be very, very competent to make. Again, a lot of centers, including us, what we will do, supposing if a patient is on DOAC and if the patient is going for, say, an elective surgery, we would try to bridge the patient to a low molecular weight heparin and continue it for a further duration of the surgery. And once the patient has recovered, you sort of, try to put the patient back on DOAC. So that's the important surgical relevance of having a patient with DOAC. And again, as I said, in the surgical, the importance is the fact that the evidences of using DOACs in surgical thromboprophylaxis is hardly there. So you have the evidence of using DOAC in non-surgical thromboprophylaxis patient. That is, in any other cancer patient with active cancer and illness who are not going for surgery, you have evidences for DOACs. But you don't really have the evidence for DOACs for surgical thromboprophylaxis. That is why when we use when a patient of DOACs is there, we normally tend to bridge them with a low molecular weight heparin. Again, it's as I said, the experience of having DOACs in cancers is pretty recent, and one must have to look at the case as a case-to-case basis. Basically, look at the half-life of the drug and try to see the risk factors so that we are able to bridge the period very safely and effectively. Having said that, there are also a couple of antidotes of DOACs as well. But these agents have been known to be pretty much safe. Of course, it is very important also to take into consideration, as I said, because they're oral agents, to make sure the bioavailability or the absorption is quite good. So you must factor in that. The more important factor is the drug-to-drug interaction. So that is something that we need to be careful. And the other telltale sign is of any sort of toxicity, so as to say, is because of the bleeding risks of these patients. So definitely there is an increased risk of bleeding, at least in the randomized controlled trials, about 1%, at least 1%, and most of these risks were pretty serious bleedings as well. And we have to be very, very cautious using in certain settings. For example, in patients who have had brain tumors, or patients who are going for a neurosurgery, all these cases we should handle with care. So if you ask for toxicity, I think we must watch out for bleeding, because that is a definite risk with the newer DOACs.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, sir. Deepak here. Can I ask a question, sir?
Sure, Deepak.
Sir, my question is, practically, sir, in after Whipple's, in high-risk patient, do you go for a one month of this anticoagulants?
No, I think it's a very important question to ask, because what happens is most of the times we sort of give the patients for 7 to 10 days. Again, we know that the guideline recommends that you give it for about 1 month. There are actually, if you see, based on the evidences for the guideline and the clinical practice is different. For example, all these agents have to be started pre-operatively, and very few centers would actually start these agents pre-operatively. Most of them would start it post-operatively, and if you see, there is hardly any evidence to support the use of these agents in the post-operative state. Again, the extended use of thromboprophylaxis is a problem because some of these patients go home. Again, to ask them to take it for 4 weeks is a technical challenge. So again, what is important is if the patient has got a high risk, for example, if the patient is aged, if the patient is obese, and if the patient has got multiple other risk factors, it is preferable that you advise the patients for taking extended thromboprophylaxis, because if a patient has got some adverse event, it could have a medico-legal implication. So what we do is we advise the patients that it is preferable for you to take extended thromboprophylaxis for up to 4 weeks based on the evidence. But again, I know that in real life, very rarely, it is always a challenge for us to make patients to comply with these orders. I think your question is bang on, bang on. The issue of compliance for these is very, very important and very, very real.
Right, sir. Can I ask a question about the benign disease, thromboembolism in benign disease, like mesenteric ischemia?
I'm not an expert. In fact, I'm not even an expert in VTE as well. But then what I decided, what I thought is that we need to sort of know about these nuances, because at the end of the day, we tend to operate on some of these patients. It is very important for us to know about these. But anyway, go ahead. I will try to sort of see whether I will be able to answer your question.
Right, sir. My question is, like, a patient has undergone a laparotomy for mesenteric ischemia, venous mesenteric ischemia.
Yeah.
So post-operatively, we have to give anticoagulants. According to the length of the bowel left behind, how will you choose that patient should remain on low molecular weight heparin or warfarin or Novax? Like, patient has 60 centimeter of jejunum,
Right. No,
100 centimeter of jejunum, or a
right. No, I think to answer your question, NOACs is an absolute no-no in these patients, because the contraindication, as I said, that DOACs should not be used in the surgical setting. So when we are talking about surgical thromboprophylaxis, we don't really have much evidence of DOACs. Maybe you may have it in the few years, but every guideline actually says don't use any of these DOACs. Try to bridge it over to some amount of low molecular weight heparin or unfractionated heparin. Again, we would not tend to use warfarin again in these patients in the immediate period. Again, because of the advent of DOACs, what has happened is slowly the warfarin is getting relegated back to sort of the second seat. The only advantage of warfarin, as I see it, is its availability and its costs, and that is the reason. But having said that, in the setting that you are talking about, in the perioperative period, it is very important to give either a low molecular weight heparin, preferably, or to give an unfractionated heparin. And that is even though the patient has got a thrombosis, I think you'll have to, there is definitely a higher risk of rethrombosis again for these patients. So one has to be really very careful on a case-by-case basis and try to put the patients on one of the agents, either a low molecular weight or unfractionated.
Sir, as a surgeon, we generally do not have a much clarification on two aspects. One is, now today we are looking at the venous thromboembolism, but many of the time the cardiologist and rest of the people, they usually do with the arterial thromboembolism. Many of the surgeons, they have a perspective in their mind that if the patient is on ecosprin like drug, that will take care of both. So what is the real scenario in practice? We can see the patient is on ecosprin also sometimes, and patient is taking NOACs also. So in such scenario, what is the actual proper guidelines, sir, and what is the safety? Because that's a confusing thing, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a lot of evidence. I didn't specifically speak about the use of aspirin or ecosprin, but there were a lot of evidences to use ecosprin. Even now, if you see in the multiple myeloma setting, see, of course, this may not be relevant truly for the surgeons, but one must put things in perspective. The multiple myeloma setting, almost all the patients require some amount of venous thromboembolic prophylaxis, and in that setting, actually, warfarin, the aspirin is one of the recommended doses. Having said that, to use aspirin purely from the thromboprophylaxis perspective, I think the evidence is literally lacking. That is one thing. The other thing is, with regards to use of heparin and surgeries, I think it's pretty clear that you can actually proceed on to surgery, especially if a patient is on low dose of ecosprin, that is about 75 milligrams, and even we in our clinical practice don't stop ecosprin if it's 75 milligrams, only if it is at a much higher dose, and if it's got if there is it's in a combination with clopidogrel, do we stop some of these agents? Again, it is very important to understand that why the patient has been started on that therapy. I think that is very, very important and crucial for us to understand. And as far as possible, we must, if the patient is on high risk, we must try to bridge the patient with preferably a low molecular weight heparin and then continue. Again, I think to use aspirin and no DOACs, again, I don't think that there is any really great evidence. We must look at the, as a case-to-case scenario why the patient was initially started on an aspirin, because nowadays people tend to start aspirin for very many conditions, even sometimes as a case of secondary chemo prevention in cancers. Also, there have been a lot of studies. Some people in colorectal they start also. So there is a lot of indications for starting aspirin. So one must really know the indication for starting the aspirin in that patient and deciding to continue on that in the presence of a DOAC.
Good evening, Sir. Karthik here.
Yes, Karthik.
Yeah, sorry, I joined the presentation after a few slides. I'm not sure if this was covered. In case of an intra-abdominal tumor with a contiguous tumor thrombus into a major vein, say a renal tumor with an IVC thrombus or a hepatic tumor with an IVC thrombus, is there any role for starting once you diagnose on anticoagulants and post in case they're going for a curative surgery? And how long are we going to continue, because since they are in a major vein thrombus?
Oh, that's a very important question. Again, the distinction is very important for us to make, whether it is actually a tumor thrombus or whether it is a part of the spectrum of a deep vein thrombus, or that is very important. And again, I must say that you'll really need to study your scans and sit with your intervention, to sit with your radiologist to see. And in case there is any tumor with a tumor thrombus per se, you need not sort of start the patient right away. But again, you'll have to sort of take it into in its entirety. Having said that, if it's a large tumor, I think again it comes in the bracket of major abdominal surgery. So definitely this patient would be necessitating some sort of prophylaxis. And of course, it all depends on how your surgery and how you sort of take your thrombus, and you sort of continue the thromboprophylaxis for at least recommendations wise. They say you give it up to 4 weeks. So it's very important to make that distinction between an actual tumor thrombus and a thrombus that has arisen as a result of deep vein thrombosis. Again, I think it's very important to go and see its extent in relation to the tumor, and more often than not, you will be able to make a diagnosis by a careful study of the scans along with your radiologist.
So preoperatively, when we are recommended to start, when we make a diagnosis, immediate after diagnosis or prior to surgery?
No, I think if it is only a tumor thrombus, then you would start the patient on preoperative, that is between 2 to 12 hours prior to surgery, and continue. This is for the surgical thromboprophylaxis, considering that you are treating the case as a tumor thrombus and not as a deep vein thrombus. If it's a deep vein thrombus, obviously you will have to start it the moment you diagnose it.
But many a times there are going to be overlaps between this tumor and the bland thrombus. There are going to be tumor thrombus which are going to be partially enhancing, and some part of the thrombus which is going to look like a deep vein thrombus.
Well, again, as I said, you'll have to study it in relation to the tumor. So that is very, very important. So I think if you're able to make that, I think these are pretty tricky calls. I agree with what you say, but I think if you sort of see a continuity of the thrombus, like for example, there are certain tumors, like as you rightly said, renal cell carcinoma, there is a thrombus that is extending into the renal vein and into the IVC. So you know that this could more commonly fit into the picture. Then again, concomitantly, what you need to sort of see is whether the patient has got a deep vein thrombus in the, say, in the iliacs or in the femorals or any other area. So that is also something that is very important to see. So sometimes what happens is you can sort of study the distal and the proximal vasculature to have a very important guesstimate based on this.
Rightly said, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Ambu Aruni, you wanted to ask a question?
So my question was already asked by previous person.
Okay, yeah, fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I think there is one question in the chat. I think Dr. Manish asked, please tell us about heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, incidence and management when using unfractionated heparin in prophylaxis. Again, it's a very important question. One of the side effects of heparin or the use of unfractionated heparin is thrombocytopenia. So again, it's very important to have a good platelet count in the patients, and majority of the guidelines say that the least platelet count is something that you'll have to have at least some 50,000. In fact, that's a bare minimum, and preferably you'll have to start with more than 80,000 to a lakh. I think that in that case you're good. You may tend to sort of give and in these settings of thrombocytopenia, as I said, the DOACs are actually contraindicated. So you can use low molecular weight heparin in some doses. Again, you'll have to risk adapt based on the setting. The other thing is you could still use heparin in those settings, but then you'll have to give some sort of platelet infusion in some of these settings. But having said that, with the use of unfractionated heparin, you would really require monitoring for these patients. So it is very important to understand that these are potential side effects of this. And with the use of heparin, you must actually sort of tend to use some sort of monitoring. So quite often they're not more or less in our practices, we have shifted to the use of low molecular weight heparins, at least in our surgical patients. And I would foresee that with the success of DOACs, at least in the non-surgical space, a lot of shift would happen. And maybe in a few years, I foresee that warfarin usage will be relegated much lesser and lesser, at least in the cardiac in the cancer perspective. Of course, in cardiac surgeries, I believe, especially when there are prosthetic valves, there is definite evidence right now to say that warfarin would be slightly better than the DOACs. But again, this is an evolving science. But there's a lot of buzz and excitement because we have good agents at this point of time, low molecular weight heparins that actually don't require much of monitoring. The DOACs also, again, don't require much of monitoring, ease of administration and compliance. So, so more or less, I feel that in majority of our practices, to be pretty safe, you could opt for one or two of the agents. But again, as I said, it's a question of logistics and where you practice. Supposing you're practicing at the community level, it may be very difficult for the patients to afford these therapies. So in such circumstances, you may be forced to use heparin or more commonly the warfarin as well. So one must understand that we'll have to monitor these patients for these sort of side effects, and if at all they occur, we have to sort of of course, the good thing about some of these agents is you have agents or antidotes that reverse partially some of these side effects. So you must be very diligent in monitoring for side effects, especially when if you are using the agents like heparin and the warfarin.
Dr. Arvind, can I ask a question? I'm Dr. Ashok here.
Sure, doctor, please.
A patient on ecosprin and who is likely to undergo Whipple's operation, and who also needs thromboprophylaxis of some sort of other based on his age and material. Now, because he is on ecosprin, what do you practice in your practice? I mean, when do you stop ecosprin, or are you likely to continue ecosprin and switch over to low molecular weight heparin just a day before? What is your practice?
I think that's a very important and a good question that you asked. Again, as I said, it all depends on the dose of ecosprin that the patient is on and the indication for starting ecosprin on that patient. So these two things are very, very, very important. And if, as I said, if the ecosprin is also a low dose, say 75 milligrams, I think it's pretty much safe. And in our practice, we don't really stop the ecosprin in those circumstances. We continue the ecosprin even on, and we continue even on day one. Also, we tend to start this. It is only when you are having the higher doses or the therapeutic doses, maybe around 300 milligrams, and especially so when it is combined with, say, an antiplatelet agent like Propylet or any of the reasons in which the patient is having some cardiac comorbidities and being started. In such circumstances, we tend to sort of stop these agents about 5 days prior to surgery, shift them to low molecular weight heparin, and gradually sort of continue these patients post-operatively also on low molecular weight heparin. Again, the duration would be risk adapted based, and then subsequently after whatever the risk, either a week or 4 weeks, we shift them back to whatever dose they have been.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shah.
Any more questions to Dr. Arvind? If there are no questions, thank you again, Arvind. Thank you so much, and then we'll see you again coming week. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.